that, was what I wanted more than money, is for accountability.
Hello and welcome to the Agile Attorney Podcast. I'm John Grant. For this first season of the podcast, I've created a series of interviews that I'm calling The Voice of the Client. I'm bringing you the stories of real people in their own voice, talking about the challenges and the successes they encounter in dealing with lawyers in the legal system. One of the cornerstones of the Agile methodology is that value can only truly be measured through the experience of your customer. And that's something that lawyers can sometimes struggle with. Not because we don't care about customer experience, but because we're trained to see things in more of a big picture. A lot of what we do is help people avoid risk or prevent harm. And the human brain, meaning the customer's brain, isn't that good at calculating the value of tragedy averted. Not only that, there can often be multiple values at play for the customer, and sometimes they're in tension with each other. Today, you'll hear from Angel, who's had some serious challenges in the workplace at the intersection of racial and gender discrimination. And there's a lot to unpack in this interview, but one of the things that I hear is an internal struggle about how to value the effort he gets from his lawyer. You'll hear him talk about getting pulled in multiple directions. And if you're in employment law, you will probably find this familiar. On the one hand, he seems to want to hold his employer accountable and seek justice, not just for himself, but for his coworkers experiencing similar issues. And it sounds to me like he doesn't really get the value he's looking for on that front. On the other hand, he seems to want to just move on with his life and career without leaving a public record trail that he worries might haunt him down the road. And you'll hear that he had sort of a hard time finding a lawyer who would help him strike the balance he was looking for at a cost he could afford. And even though his feedback about that lawyer is mixed, I feel like that lawyer taught Angel some things that turned out to be really useful when similar issues popped up in the next job that he had. I'll offer a few other takeaways at the end of the interview, so be sure to listen all the way through. We'll get started right after this message. Are you a little suspicious of the cult of hustle? Those so-called business gurus who talk about hypergrowth or 10xing your business if you just give yourself over to the hype and buy into the privilege of following their plan? Don't get me wrong, I am all about growth and setting goals and putting in the work to meet them. But if you're like me, you'd probably prefer working smarter, not harder, whenever possible. And that's where bottleneck theory comes in. I won't give you the full lesson on bottleneck theory. You can find that on my website at agileattorney.com. But here's the high-level thing you need to know. Your law practice is made up of 3 high-level pipelines that work together to power your success. You have a getting the work pipeline that's made up of the sales and marketing and outreach efforts. You have a doing the work pipeline that's where you deliver the work that your client is asking for. And you have a getting paid pipeline where the actual exchange of value happens. Right now, and really at any time, only one of those pipelines contains the bottleneck that is preventing your practice from being more successful. And yes, I said the bottleneck. There can only be one. You might feel like there are a million things in your practice that you'd like to improve, but just like every chain has a weakest link, every practice has a single worst bottleneck. Here's the good news. If you can improve the flow of work at that bottleneck, then you will improve the success of your entire enterprise. And that makes sense. If you shore up the weakest link, then the whole chain gets stronger. But the real power in bottleneck theory comes from this second part, which is easy to understand intellectually, but can be a lot harder to put into practice. It goes like this. Any improvement that you make to part of your system that isn't your bottleneck won't help. So think about it. If your bottleneck is in your delivery pipeline, but you do something to improve your marketing or your intake, then all you're going to do is slam more cars into an ever-worsening traffic jam. In other words, you can spend good money, not to mention your time and attention and effort, investing in something that, even if it works exactly as you hoped, will actually make things worse. And of course, if you fix something downstream of your bottleneck, it won't matter because most of your work is just going to get stuck before it gets there. So the key to working smarter and not harder is first finding your bottleneck, which isn't always easy, and then having a plan and a method for improving the flow of work that's getting stuck there. And that's where I can help. I've developed a 90-minute workshop that I'm calling my Bottleneck Breakthrough Jam. It's designed to quickly assess the overall health of your practice from a strategy and operations perspective, help you identify that one key bottleneck that is holding back your practice, and leave you with 1 or 2 concrete steps you can take to open up that bottleneck and get things flowing more smoothly. I guarantee that you will come out of our session feeling empowered and energized about your practice, and knowing exactly what to do to get to the next level. And I literally mean guarantee. If you aren't satisfied after we're done, I will refund your money. Now, we're not going to 10x you overnight, and we're not going to fix all the things in 90 minutes, but you will leave with an actionable plan for fixing the right thing that will have an outsized impact on your productivity. To learn more, go to agileattorney.com/BBJ for Bottleneck Breakthrough Jam. That's agileattorney.com/BBJ. You're going to love how much better you feel about your practice when we're done. And yes, I guarantee it. Today, I'm speaking with Angel. And Angel, who are you and where are you from?
Well, I am a native Chicagoan, and I work in mostly marketing and other forms of content development for organizations that are typically dedicated to different social justice issues or to enhancing awareness of needs of different professions.
Awesome. So tell me about a specific time when you had to hire a lawyer. What was going on in your life that caused that to have to happen?
Well, it's an interesting question because there have been many times when I've thought about hiring a lawyer or been advised to, but there was only one time when I was sort of cornered into hiring one. And it was when I was, beginning to negotiate a separation agreement from an employer that had the history of employees hiring attorneys to kind of work through the red tape that the employer had created for them.
Oh, interesting. So without going too much into the specific situation, although feel free to if you want to, like what were you feeling? Like you talked about other times where you've thought about it, like what sort of emotional, psychological, like what was going on in your head that caused you to like make that choice this time?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say every other time I've thought about doing it, especially as it pertains to an employment situation, the main concern has been that in the era of Google, you litigate or even bring any sort of action against an employer outside of an EEOC complaint or another administrative complaint, it becomes public.
Right.
You're looking for a job and, the hiring manager Googles you, and the first thing that comes up is a suit, whether it was
Right.
absolutely legitimate or imperative to do it, or, whether it was made in bad faith, it's going to be there. Typically employers don't want to work with somebody who is litigious for any reason, even if it's Anita Hill level. Or much more egregious, like in a lot of the tech companies. So that had been my deterrent before, and in general, I was just of the mind, as someone who doesn't have a lot of time to waste when it comes to income. I just often had the opinion that if a job is not working out, the most important thing to do is to find a new one, even if it's not working out due to, breaches of contract or other legal issues. The, key thing is to hurry up and find a new one and get out of it. But this time it was different because I was presented with this separation agreement, that like so many of them asked me to give up my rights to make any claims, whether legal or, in conversation with other people in conversations that were not explicitly legal to, give up any claims of racism or homophobia or age-based discrimination or anything else that I had indeed experienced, with this employer and had, been speaking up about for years at that point. So it was very important to, renegotiate the terms of the separation agreement if there was going to be, an agreement signed. And also, given what the experiences had been and what I knew of other settlements, what I was being offered just was not sufficient for the rights that I was being, pressured to give up.
Got it. So there were a couple pieces to the puzzle, both sort of the doing right by the world in terms of the claims that you had, and also the financial component was maybe a little light.
It was very light. The
Okay.
employer had, done what's the term I'm looking for? A number of people who were much more seasoned employees had been let go or had been given the option of being let go in exchange for early retirement. And they were given something much closer to 2 years of their salary, plus the opportunity to, do freelance work for the employer in the meanwhile. And I, meanwhile, had been offered a few weeks of pay, which, was going to have the effect of requiring me to withdraw my 401k from a previous employer just to keep head above water. And I did end up having to do that. But, there are some other upsides that we may or may not get into later.
Okay. Well, so in terms of like, how did you go about finding a lawyer to work with?
It was interesting, for over a year at least, I had been shopping for lawyers. I kind of saw this coming, and also there had been a lot of tension with, some of the white women at the organization in me that, had shades of what used to happen in the Jim Crow South and what
Mhm.
happens, what has made the news more recently with,
Right.
the situation in Central Park with, the ornithologist and the woman who, threatened him with police call, where, consistently, I'd be trapped in these conversations and be threatened with action from, white women who were made uncomfortable by what was said. So
Wow.
anyway, I knew that I was in a tiff and that I might be terminated, and they were just looking for a legitimate reason to do it. So I, began writing and calling around the state where I live for attorneys. And the problem that I kept running into, there were a few. One was that the attorneys often had conflicts of interest. Either they had some kind of working relationship with people at my employer, or they were representing other employees there. And in some cases, the other employees had discrimination cases against my employer that would
Hmm.
seem to conflict with my own. For example, one might be saying, this organization has discriminated against me because I am of this gender and of this race. And, I'm not of that gender and not of that race. And so it was very difficult for that person to keep pursuing his current client's case and, also take on mine without there, being a kind of rhetorical conflict in the case
Right.
that he was making.
Did you find that lawyers were open about talking to you about their reasons for a conflict, or were they more vague, or did you get a little of
Well, there were
each?
there were so many who I spoke to, and in some cases they flatly told me I have a conflict of interest. I cannot take this on. Others said, I have a long relationship with this employer, and that's why I can't take it on. And then, a few just outright told me, well, I am working with this other past or current employee who is dealing with this specific situation, and these are, the basic details of it. And, I really believe that your employer has been treating you badly. I think that they are also retaliating against you. But I can't take on your case right now because, when the case that I'm currently working on against your employer goes to court, if they know that I'm also representing you, then the judge and, other side is going to challenge my claims on the basis of the claims that I'm also making for you.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating because I mean, you live in an area that should not be short on employment lawyers.
Certainly, but the other challenge would be, as I'm sure you hear so often, cost of services, and a lot of us who are seeking employment attorneys, really are looking for the work to be done on a contingency basis. But
Right.
for the attorneys, I believe, and I'm sure they believe as well, it's just often not fair unless the case can be settled very quickly. In my case, the facts were just loading up over some years. It began with another employee, making a very, blatantly discriminatory mark and threat. And, it's snowballing from then on. At the time of the genesis of the situation came about, I had no idea that it could materialize into what it came into, but the reason why it really snowballed as such, I think, is that the employer sued or threatened with suit so often by its employees, partially by virtue of, who its employees are and, what their backgrounds are in terms of
Hmm.
education and the work that they do. Also in consequence to what the employer, I should say, habitually does to its employees.
Right. Boy, that yeah, sounds like a charming workplace.
It's interesting. I'm still recovering, but I tell you what, it was not the last time that I dealt with such a situation, or at least not on not on those terms. But I've dealt with similar situations since then, and if nothing else, I've learned to kind of study my emotions in response to it.
Yeah. So how did you finally decide on a lawyer?
A few things. One, so many were unable to take on the case, or were giving a lot of pushback about the way to bill and how much to bill, and I just knew I wasn't going to give up my savings for this particular case. It just didn't make sense. I'm aware of how much these cases usually result in terms of settlement. And it just was not, in my mind to spend a lot of money on it, or really to spend more than a three-figure amount on it. So this one attorney who I came upon, a young guy, he really believed in the good cause, very conscientious. And he never doubted me. I told him what the details of the case were, and he had a good read on it immediately. And he was not somebody who personally, could have experienced the set of circumstances that I experienced, but he had known many others, through law school and through, the cases that he had taken on in his few short years as an attorney who had dealt with similar things. And so, for me, it was very critical that whomever I hired actually believed that I was saying was true, wasn't sort of just taking it on to take on a case. Two, he was willing to work on, a contingency, which was a percentage of whatever I was awarded, if
Right.
it was awarded in response to, the case that he was making. Plus, the initial, I forget the proper term for it, but the initial, three-figure amount that I paid for the, kind of intake and discussion and the, writing of a demand letter.
Tell me about like how much did this attorney sort of orient you to the process that you were about to undergo?
Well, as I remember, he sent an engagement letter. It wasn't very long. I had seen some other engagement letters from other attorneys who had been shopping, in particular when they came from larger firms. They were sometimes very long, and
Right.
very cumbersome to work through. And I thought, this is creating a lot of work for me beyond the actual work of, simply trying to do whatever I'm going to do in response to what's happening with this employer. But his engagement letter, as I recall, was just about 2 to 3 pages long, just very straightforward. I knew that I needed somebody to help write a demand letter. I did not know at the time the terminology of the case that I was fighting, or the scope of the different laws that had been violated. And he knew right away. And so I knew no matter what, as long as there was not a clause in his engagement letter, that was going to trick me into paying a lot more than I intended to pay, I was going to
Right.
come on. Because he believed in the cause. He had the time to do it, or at least to do it, for as long as it didn't go on for longer than 2 months. And he wasn't charging me for very much.
Yeah. Did you feel like you had a good understanding of what the steps were, right? I mean, starting obviously with the demand letter, but did you get a good roadmap in terms of, if that was step A, then what steps B, C, and D might look like?
Well, it's an interesting question because I have a lot of attorneys in my family. Some of them, as you may have seen elsewhere, are quite successful. And I knew I knew how far I didn't want this to go, at least for that year, or while I was searching for new employment. And I was very clear about the impact that I wanted a demand letter to have on the employer. And so, even though the attorney may not have been fully aware of my intentions, I knew what I was doing. He didn't have to create a roadmap for me because I knew how far I was going to take this thing in that year.
Got it. What sorts of frustrations did you have with your attorney? I mean, what do you think he could have done differently or better that would have made your experience better?
Well, I mean, I would say one thing was when the demand letter was sent and the response came, and the employer was just emphatic that they weren't going to do anything on our behalf. I felt that he was giving up very easily. And I was, on the other hand, sort of like, well, I mean, in their response, they're also retaliating by making additional threats. And so there is actually more. We now have more of a case against them. They've actually made it easier for us. But this attorney I was working with, by virtue of his youth, and he was trying to build a solo firm, and had only been at it for, I think, several months. After having worked at a larger firm for
Mm-hmm.
2 or 3 years, and he was finding, during the course of our first month or two together, and actually it was only 3 months total, I think. He was finding that clients were coming on faster than he, could handle them, and that he wasn't going to have such a hard time getting new clients, and that my case, if we were to see it through, potentially could take a very long time. Because there was a lot to it. There were many bad actors in the case. There was an essential villain, so to speak, and it had gone on for some years. And so he was, he appeared ready to give up. He did believe that the case was of merit. He just didn't think that he had the time to, see it through to what the employer was trying to ask us to see it through if we were serious about it.
Interesting. Do you feel like he was actively trying to encourage you to settle?
Not really. Actually, I would say no to that emphatically. We had another phone conversation. He insisted that I sue and said that I should do it fast and kind of schooled me by saying, you may think that gender and sexual orientation are central to your case, but, having spoken with you and having met many other people who dealt with similar situations in the workforce, I can tell you that race is the fundamental issue with your employer. And that there is this particular law that, if you want to sue any time in the next 4 years, you can do it. That will cover you. That will provide more coverage than the statute of limitations provided under EEO law covers. And you absolutely should do it. And then I, of course, explained to him again my concerns about how that would impact me professionally, once it made, once it became searchable. He responded by saying, honestly, I think that people will still want to hire you and that there will be those who will want to work with you because you did this. I think about it a lot, and I think about it a lot in the context of different news items that have emerged this year. Really, what's odd is even though in a way it was settled, in an odd, unexpected way it was settled. Emotionally, it's not very settled. And there are still people out there for whom I think there were no consequences. And that, was what I wanted more than money, is for accountability and people to be held responsible through this collaboration with the attorney.
Right. So did you wind up suing?
I did not wind up suing. I ended up finding another job that paid a lot more, and I found it very quickly. And there were other problems. I really can't say very much at all about that. But what I will tell you is that I learned a lot from the attorney about how to litigate and write a demand letter. And in my next situation, I was the attorney, and I was very successful.
Got it. Did you? Because it's interesting, and I've worked with a few employment attorneys, and I know one of the things is a duty to mitigate damages, right? So is the fact that you got another job and a better job so quickly, was that part of the calculation for not suing?
My own, yes. And the reason why this attorney wanted me to sue very quickly actually had a lot to do with the risk that I was going to get another job fast. The idea, as you said, was, if I found another job fast, and certainly if it was revealed that it paid a lot more than the job at the organization that I had been working, with the attorney to address, then it would be difficult to say that I had, sustained, significant damages, due to my employment termination and due to the, discrimination and retaliation that I encountered over the years prior. So yeah,
Right.
that was a part of the calculation. But again, the main element I would say was, just a general belief amongst employers that, even amongst the most conscientious employers, I think, that an employee who sues their employer is a dangerous employee.
Yeah, I mean, how do you square that? Because I mean, what's fascinating to me about that is what I'm hearing from you is your primary driver for this wasn't so much a selfish quest for compensation for the harms that you'd endured, but as you said a minute ago, accountability, trying to help make sure that others who come after you don't have to go through similar things. Well, and actually, let me phrase that as a question. Was it more about protecting people in the future? Was it about holding wrongdoers accountable, or some combination of both?
Both, for sure, I would say. And the thing is, other people who were on staff at this organization, and at various levels, from receptionists on up to, much more senior levels. And then the people who the association served who had been witnessing a lot of what I had been experiencing were putting me under a lot of pressure to take action, to sue or to settle or to, take administrative action or to go public with it, to, write about it and to, put out there what had been said and what had been happening, because it was very disturbing for them. And they, were having sort of crises of conscience about continuing to work for, otherwise engage with this organization, knowing that the organization did this to me and had been doing it to others before. And it was just so egregious and obvious. There wasn't really a large side that was saying, Angel did not, is making this up, or, he has really done us wrong. There were there were many people who often didn't know each other who felt strongly that this was a case that required action, that was a moral matter.
Right. So pretty clear to people that this organization needs to change their behaviors, and they were sort of hoping that you would be the catalyst for that change.
Exactly. Yeah. And they also felt that I should be well off financially. They knew that I had well off financially in response to, what had happened in this situation. A lot of people knew about me and my life outside of work. And they understood that an employment termination was going to be devastating, that there were not a lot of resources to turn to. And I had worked, very hard to elevate the people the organization was serving and to elevate the people within, who work for the organization as well. And so it, number one came as a shock to a lot of people that this was happening. They were thinking, oh, it's time for him to get promoted. This is going to be his big year. And when the opposite happened, like it really blew a lot of people. And there was anger and there was emotion and there were tears from some people as well.
Wow. Yeah. Do you feel like your lawyer understood your goals?
I think so. He and I had a very candid relationship, and I'm loquacious. As you know, I don't I try to be cautious to the extent that, decorum requires. But if I think that something is going to be a benefit to, somebody I'm working with, then I'm happy to share it. I had sort of been writing about the case for a long time. I had been filing, I filed an EOC complaint, in the year prior to working with the attorney. And I had written an affidavit that was quite long in connection with the case. Dozens of pages long, and he had that at his disposal. So, there wasn't really a lot of gray there. If anything, he probably felt overwhelmed by his understanding of it.
Right. Do you feel like you got a fair result with the outcome?
No, no. I got a result, and that was I got more than what I had intending to get, but it was off the cuff. It was almost like it felt like a bribe. It's really informal and odd. And so, no, I didn't. I think when I found a new job and it paid a lot more, I thought, oh, well, maybe looking at this cosmically, this was for the best. But then in that situation, other, problems that in some ways were much more serious very quickly manifested. And so I was left to deal with a new situation and to focus squarely on that, thinking, oh, I put the previous situation behind me. But once the next situation was addressed, then I had additional time in my hands to think about the extent to which the earlier situation had not been resolved. And yet so much time had passed, it began to feel, a little absurd to think on it more. Honestly, some of the relationships that I had been able to maintain, in some cases and salvage, and others from, the situation from some years ago that the attorney had been addressing. I was so grateful for them. I was almost afraid to, revisit the situation and the time that was remaining to keep addressing it.
Right. What do you wish your lawyer had done differently?
Number one, I would say standing his ground, on the face of the initial response. I do think that a better agreement could have been negotiated. And ultimately, I didn't sign an agreement. That was the thing. I think it was odd that, so much compelling evidence was put before them. And just, the person who responded on behalf of the employer had only been working for the employer for, 2 or 3 months, I think, and really didn't know enough to be able to be the person to shut this thing down. And so, I thought it was surprising. Didn't know enough about the case, to be able to shut it down easily. I thought it was surprising that my attorney was giving up so easily. So I would say that was the main thing. If he had, just at least responded to that, we are going to keep pushing this and you should really rethink your decision to rebuff us. I wish that he had at least done that, for the sake of validating the conscientiousness that he had demonstrated to me in our initial intake.
So and it sounds to me at least like his situation changed over the course of his
Mhm.
representation of you.
Yep, he acquired a lot of additional work. He also realized the scope of the work that we were potentially getting into. And then I
Right.
think he also knew that I wasn't attempting to sue right in that moment, at least. And that was the next thing to do. And so it
Hmm.
was sort of like, what can I, as an employment attorney, do for you beyond what I've already done without charging you more?
If you had to do it all over again, would you hire the same lawyer?
I mean, I would say no, and it's not because it's not a reflection on any negative feelings about him. I actually think he's a very good lawyer in general. He understands the nuances of cases. He was able to get a read on what laws have been violated very rapidly. And he wrote, his letter was very well written. But, for that particular case, I just think it's better for the current or past employers to interface directly with the employer, especially if you are a skilled writer and if you have a knowledge of what the laws are. It's no fee. You can do it. And, if you have a community of, friends or family or others who can kind of serve as your editors and advisors, to me, there's no reason why your letter or the case that you began making prior to, anything going to court shouldn't be as compelling or as impactful as what an attorney can make. That's just what I think.
Right. Do you think your lawyer did a good job keeping you in the loop? I know it sounds like your matter wasn't all that long, but did you feel well informed?
Yeah, I mean, I did. He forwarded what they would share with me very quickly, and he would schedule a call to discuss. He was very diligent about communications and staying on top of things. Not waiting days
Right.
to figure out what to do next. Whether we should do anything next.
Overall, did it take longer than you expected, shorter than you expected, or about what you figured?
I mean, the whole thing went on with the attorney at least for about a month and a half, which was pretty short, I thought.
Okay.
But the employer, really kind of pulled this underhanded solution of a stunt of just like presenting a like off the cuff bribe of sorts, and that made it very hard to pursue any further conversation. It was sort of like, well, either I'm going to take this and not say anything else, or without saying very much more, without getting into specifics, essentially I felt pushed into a corner, and there wasn't a lot more that I could do, once that happened, and then also once I got a new job, with the time that I had to keep addressing it.
Do you feel like that? And was your employer working through their lawyer, or was it through someone else?
Well, they had their own general counsel.
Okay.
They have a number of people, in that group within the organization who work in that capacity, and they get a lot of these EEOC complaints, and so they are kind of always prepared to address them. And initially, when my case materialized, some years before it came to me hiring an attorney, when I was still an employee and still had some years of employment left with this particular organization. They had actually said to me internally, we're going to file an EEOC complaint on your behalf against, this person within the company, which I think was their effort to bamboozle me, somebody who they presumed did not understand how these laws and, these administrative actions worked, into not taking action myself.
Oh, interesting. So, do you feel like that the lawyers on the other side were engaged in deceptive behavior?
Oh, for sure, absolutely. They were used to doing this. A lot of their other cases with employees had made news. In some cases, very high-profile publications like the Tribune and the Washington Post, and it was just sort of a known thing. Glassdoor as well, that this employee has a long history. Going back decades of conflicts with employees, especially around race, health, and sexual orientation. And so they were used to this sort of thing. And when it first emerged on my end, I didn't really think of it as a case. I had been threatened internally, and I wanted the help of HR, but the reaction to it internally was to kind of begin a sort of pre-litigation against me, which was a surprise. I simply wanted HR to help me feel safer at the organization, but the reaction was to kind of wrap me in their own pre-litigation.
Wow. Yeah. And it's one of those, I mean, I'm struck by this sort of contrast between the concern that you articulated earlier in this conversation, that you didn't want the existence of this case to create a bad reputation for you that was going to stick with you. And yet it sounds like this organization was brazen about it, right?
Was brazen about it. Yeah, I would say as much. I'm sorry to disrupt, but yeah, I mean, it was interesting. Like I remember when it first started, about 3 years before the attorney was hired, and they were pushing me to come and speak formally about it with HR, and I was just saying on the phone, I can't be talking to you about this right now. I really don't want to do this. There are people who can hear me who are sitting around me, and I really don't want any trouble. I in the past. I said this, in the past, I've dealt with bullying, in different environments. And my experience is just better to not say anything, to just like let it roll off. And if you could just move me into a different role or to, a different workspace within the office, then I think all will be resolved. That's the resolution that I'm looking for. But, instead they sort of set up this meeting and called down some more senior staff who were there unexpectedly and just really, really cornered me.
Did those lawyers for the organization, I mean, did they lead you to believe that they were looking out for you? I mean, it sounds like at least at one point they did when they filed an EEOC claim on your behalf
Well,
or
they said
offered
they
to.
were going to do that, but they were saying that they were going. They were saying that they were going to do that to get me to not do it. I believe they did not end up filing an EEOC
Oh,
complaint. And actually, the person who said she was going to do that, a very senior person, was later fired for her own, indiscretions. But she was fired before I was terminated.
wow.
It had something to do with behaviors like that, as well as other, like maybe there was a lot of stealing happening at the company, and she may have had something to do with that. I'm not sure of exactly what it was, but she was fired herself.
Wow. Getting back to the lawyer that you hired, how much do you feel like your lawyer was checking in with you, sort of as a human, as a person, to see how you were doing through the process?
I don't know that that was fundamental to our discussions at all, and maybe that was because I really didn't want it to be. I wanted fast section, and I sort of gave him the timeline for how when I wanted the demand letter to be presented, and what I thought an appropriate length for it to be was. In fact, I think I said to him, "Don't make it more than 2 or 3 pages because we don't want to overwhelm them with content." And he ended up making it about 7 pages, I think, to begin with, and then I had him whittle it down to something shorter than that. But I was putting a lot of pressure on him to not engage me or himself too much emotionally over it, but instead to lay it out and make this case and pressure them to change this agreement as
Right.
best they could. I wanted to move on and not sort of be going on interviews or more interviews for jobs with this thing compartmentalized or lurking in my mind, this very adversarial experience.
I mean, I know the answer to this, I think, but I mean, let me ask it this way: how stressful was that time for you?
It was a high stress time. And, my life is actually, I have a friend who said to me, let me ask you this. This was several years ago, but this is very telling for the answer to your question. She said, let me ask you this. Your life is stressful, right? And I said, yes. And she said, and it's always been stressful, right? Pretty much since you were born. And I said, yes. And I said, what made you think of that? And she said, well, we've known each other since we were 12 years old. And I remember then that you were in some highly stressful situations. Your parents were engaged in a big trial and it was making the news. You were being bullied at school. You were dealing with coming out. There were a lot of things happening at once. And I knew that, those things, the conversations had begun before I met you. So we were only 12 then. And, you must have been going through it pretty much as long as you could remember. And I said, that is indeed right. But, during this time when I hired the attorney, a few other things were happening. One, I was going to have to find a new job and fast. I didn't have sort of an inheritance from family to live off of. I was not married. I don't have other family or friends who are able to provide for me in the event of such a situation. I wasn't familiar with how to go find me work for this sort of thing. I needed to find a new job very fast. And, I had sort of been looking for other jobs, in the state where I live for some years up until that point, actually. And I wasn't very successful. I wasn't successful. I was encountering a lot of employers who, honestly, I think were making excuses not to hire somebody who would diversify their workforce. I'm in a field that tends to skew very heavily. And actually, one of the interviewers said this to me. 90% of the people who work for us in this field are white women, and we want to change this by exploring hiring you. But that was the way it was with most of the people I was interviewing with. And so I, was not able to find a job easily. I was very stressed about that. I had my family home and a mortgage on it, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to keep paying for that. And this was the home, where I had been living with somebody I cared for a lot, and she had died, not much earlier than this whole case began. And so I was having to deal with the stress on top of finding a job, but potentially having
Oh,
to move out
wow.
of a house that I had a lot of emotion invested to because I was not going to be able to afford to keep paying for it. And that had always been my home, or at least my formal residence, even when I was subletting or living elsewhere. So that was two. And then three, I knew that, if I didn't find a job very quickly because I had very little left in savings, I was going to have to withdraw my retirement from my previous job that had gone very well, from the job that I'd had some years before, the job that we've mostly been talking about. And so then, that was withdrawn, and there was my retirement. And then four, because I could not, I had not been having success finding work, where I lived. I knew I was going to have to finally consider moving and living elsewhere. And so I was dealing with a cross country move and an attempt to, interview for and search for jobs while living in an area where I had, very little community and where the cost of living was very high. So
Right.
in short, stress was high.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, it's a whole lot of life going on, it sounds like.
Yes.
Well, let me ask a couple of questions just to wrap up. Specific to your lawyer, do you feel like your lawyer gave you good advice?
Interesting. I mean, I would say yes for sure, and I'd tell you that to go back with kind of the situation that I found myself in next. He left me so clear on how to write about and talk about things, and how to kind of manage relationships with employees who were being threatening, such that I wouldn't entrap myself. That when I found myself in a bad situation later, I knew, okay, what I'm going to do is not create a paper trail that incriminates me. Number one. Number two, I'm going to let these people be combative and let them create the paper trail. And number three, I'm going to be aware at every point, without saying so, of what laws are being violated, and document. And if this comes to a similar situation with a similarly challenging outcome, I'm going to know what to do right away. And thanks to this attorney, I did, and I was successful with the knowledge that he dispensed.
Oh, that's great. Did your lawyer ask you for feedback after you were done?
I don't know that he did ask me for a testimony. That might have had something to do with my, earlier and off-stated concern about this becoming public knowledge or exposing
Right.
someone. What value are testimonials really when they're anonymous? Well, maybe they are valuable to attorneys, but I would think that they are better when the person is willing to state, at least, some identifying details of who he or she or they are.
And I'm thinking even different, because I understand the value of testimonials from a marketing standpoint, but I mean, just, it sounds like a relatively new attorney. Did he ask, hey, what went well, what didn't go well, what could I have done better?
Mhm. I don't think he ever asked what could I have done better. But the other thing is, I kept telling him, throughout the course of our relationship, I really appreciate what you're doing, and I like, the way that you're doing this particular thing so much, and how you wrote the letter, just the language that you use is really impressive. I was giving him a lot of positive reinforcement, in part because I knew that he was working on a contingency basis, with a very low, initial fee. And I wanted to do everything in my limited power to discourage him from, moving on very quickly.
Right.
And so he was getting a lot of feedback from me, as a way for me to try to maintain relationship.
Yeah. It sounds like you were sort of managing up almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not almost. That is what I was
Yeah.
doing.
Okay. Well, those are the questions I have. And I really thank you so much, Angel, for being so candid. Any other thoughts that you would want to share My audience is lawyers primarily. So anything that you would want to share with lawyers about how they could, work with people in situations like yours.
Yeah, absolutely. And, despite my negative experience with a lot of people in the past with my employer and whatnot, I am a big fan of that profession. And I think they do matter. I think that there will be a place for them no matter what's happening in terms of technology. I think the key is to not, sort of enter into these relationships prepared to discourage the person from, um, by the person, I mean, what do you call us? The
The
plaintiff,
client.
the client, not discourage the client from moving forward. We're aware of what the expenses are, or in many cases, we're aware of, what the probable outcome will be. Those who are willing to who've gone into this profession in part to be advocates for social justice or to, be the voice of conscientiousness. So I would say bottom line is, being willing to take on intake for no fee and really listen to us and consider taking us on, even if we don't have or we can't guarantee off the bat the ability to, pay you what you want. We appreciate that.
Right. Well, thank you again for your time and your honesty, and I wish you the best. I hope that your current situation is better than the
It's
past
pretty
one.
good. It's pretty good. I really sought out, yeah, the person I work with, and that was a departure from what I had previously done, which was kind of falling into or being placed. And so it's going really well so far. I think, despite the larger economic environment that we're all operating in.
Right, of course. The new normal, or the next new
Yeah, and I mean
normal.
that's absolutely impacting me. But I'll tell you something else. When it comes to these employment situations, it also really helps to have leadership that are on your side before you even say what your side is. And we've got a leader at this particular organization who is very serious and speaks from the heart about these issues. And so it's sort of like, God, what would have happened if I had had her, at the helm this whole time, as opposed to, the sorts of people that she would like to squash like bugs.
Right. Well, I'm glad you found a good situation, and thank you for your time. And I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for everything. Bye.
So, a few things I thought were interesting that I didn't mention in the intro. One is the changing situation of the attorney himself. Angel caught him pretty early in his new practice when the lawyer seemed to be worried that the cases might not actually come in. But he pretty quickly realized something that my consulting clients in the employment field tell me all the time. The demand for employment lawyers is effectively bottomless. That means that the lawyers get to be pickier about the cases they choose, but it also has some access to justice implications for clients who aren't willing to spend either some money up front or endure the stress of litigation long enough to hold out for bigger settlements. I thought it was interesting that when I asked Angel if he'd hire the same lawyer again, he says he'd have done it himself, even though he only spent a few $100s on the demand letter. On the one hand, that affirms what I said in the intro about Angel having gotten some valuable information and insight from his lawyer. I think him saying that he'd do it himself next time has at least a whiff of 2020 hindsight. On the other hand, there's a disconnect between the value exchange where Angel may not recognize that the tools and information he learned for just a few $100 are probably a screaming deal if he can use them the rest of his career. I'd love to hear what your takeaways are from this episode, and the best way to join a conversation about it is to join the free Agile Attorney Network by going to agileattorney.com/network. Of course, you can also engage with me on Twitter or Instagram at JEGrant3, on LinkedIn under John E. Grant3, and on Facebook under the Agile Attorney Network. You can also send comments through the voice messaging widget at agileattorney.com/podcast, where you can also find all the other ways to connect with me. I'll be back next week with another Voice of the Client interview. Until then, be well and stay agile.